Hiker vanishes from the Appalachian Trail. Rangers can't believe what happened. 6 weeks into patrolling the Appalachian Mountains, Ranger Teddy Gavin hadn't seen anything he couldn't explain, until a man with no shoes and nothing but a pair of overalls stepped out of the tree line and told him he had 3 guesses to save a woman's life. The second Gavin laid eyes on him, he knew this was going to be a strange one. Nothing could have prepared him for exactly how strange. He'd been rolling slow down the trail access road on a routine Thursday patrol, first week of November, radio crackling static every few miles the way it always did out past the ridgeline. 6 weeks into the job, and the Smokies still hadn't thrown him anything he couldn't explain. Not until he came around that bend. He rounded the curve and a man was already standing in the middle of the road, not walking toward the Bronco, not waving anyone down, just standing there barefoot in a pair of stained overalls, like he'd been waiting for this exact truck to come around this exact curve. Gavin's first thought was a wellness check, a lost camper maybe, someone who'd wandered off a side trail without boots on. That thought lasted about 4 seconds. It wouldn't survive what came next. Gavin braked hard enough to feel it in his chest. Before he could roll the window down all the way, the man was already talking, and something about the rhythm of it didn't sit right. Flat, unhurried, like a line he'd said so many times it had worn smooth. "You have 3 guesses. Guess my name and I'll tell you where she is." Gavin asked him to repeat that. The man repeated it, word for word, same pacing, same flat delivery. Gavin's training finally caught up with his mouth, and his voice went sharp. If a woman was hurt, he needed to know right now, no games. The man said it a 3rd time anyway, patient, almost bored, like a man reading a menu he'd memorized years ago. He wasn't asking twice because he was confused. He was asking twice because nothing about the man's mouth matched the rhythm of someone under any kind of stress. And Gavin wouldn't understand why that bothered him so much until it was far too late to matter. The overalls had rust-brown stains worked deep into both knees. Old stains, dark enough that Gavin's eyes caught there and didn't want to move. He guessed a name, Jebediah. Mostly just to buy himself a second to think, the way you throw out any answer when someone's staring at you and waiting. Nope, that's 1. 2 guesses left. Gavin didn't know yet that the number would matter more than anything else that happened this week, that somewhere down the line, running out of guesses would mean something a lot worse than losing a game. And with that, the man turned and walked back into the trees. No run, no flinch at the cold rock under his bare feet. Unhurried, like he had somewhere to be, and knew exactly how long it would take him to get there. That was the part that stuck with Gavin, the whole drive back to the station. A man who runs is scared of something. A man who strolls was never worried at all. He radioed it in before he'd even reached the main road, already turning the guesses over in his head. 1 down, 2 left. Dispatch picked up on the second ring. It was Ruth. "Hey, it's Ruth. You still out by the South Access?" Her voice came in easy over the radio, a little proud, trying not to sound like she was checking up on anyone. She mentioned her daughter Callie was 3 days into a solo section hike, should be coming up on Icewater Spring right about now if she'd kept her pace. Gavin's stomach dropped somewhere between one word and the next. He didn't answer right away. He was back at his desk that morning instead, a stack of permits, a stamp, a name he'd read but hadn't actually read. The permit had come across his desk, with the handwriting slanted hard to the left, ink smudged where a palm had dragged over it while it was still wet. He remembered the smudge before he remembered the name attached to it. Callie Soul. He'd stamped it and moved on to the next one in the stack. He told Ruth everything sounded fine, that he'd keep an eye out, and clicked off before she could hear whatever was happening to his voice. He didn't tell Chief Ranger Dale Petrie about Callie either. He told him about the man in the road instead, kept it clinical, kept his hands steady on the radio. Petrie's answer came back almost before Gavin finished the sentence. Local weirdos, panhandlers, the mountain had a few. And something about how fast that answer arrived made Gavin wonder if Petrie had a second thought he wasn't saying out loud. The next morning, the station phone rang. Not Gavin's radio. The actual station line, the one with a number that wasn't printed anywhere a stranger could just find it. Same voice, same flat, patient cadence, except now there was something under it Gavin couldn't name yet. The kind of thing that clings to a man who lives outside and doesn't wash much. Gavin threatened him with everything he had. Real consequences, real charges, real jail time. The man didn't flinch, didn't rush, didn't even seem to be listening. Gavin guessed again. Thomas. Nope. That's 2. The line went dead before Gavin could ask the one question that actually mattered. How a barefoot man standing in the middle of a gravel road 24 hours ago had somehow gotten hold of a number that wasn't public. Nobody just found that number. You had to already know the building. That same morning, Callie Sowell was reported missing. It hit the local news before lunch. Gavin had already known for a full day and hadn't said a word to the one person who needed to hear it. Petrie authorized a search team, staged back at the flagdown site where Gavin had first seen the man. 3 of them going in. Gavin, Ranger Sims, senior enough to have outlasted 4 other transfers, and Ranger Dublin, quiet, methodical. The kind of guy who checked his gear twice before checking it a 3rd time. In the Jeep on the way out, Sims turned around in his seat. You're the one he keeps calling. Why you? Gavin didn't have an answer. It sat in his chest the whole ride out, heavier than it had any right to be for a question that simple. They reached the tree line right where the man had walked in the day before. And there he was again, barefoot, still, watching them from the edge of the trees like he'd been standing in that exact spot the whole time, waiting on their schedule instead of his own. Nobody in that Jeep knew yet that he'd been watching them arrive for longer than any of them would have guessed. The second they moved to go after him, the Jeep was gone. Not stolen in a scramble, not hot-wired in a panic, gone clean, keys and all, while all 3 of them had their eyes locked on the man at the tree line. He hadn't moved. He couldn't have taken it. Nobody said that part out loud, but all 3 of them were already thinking it. 10 miles out, on foot with no working radio. Dusk was maybe 5 hours off, and the temperature already had a bite to it that hadn't been there an hour before. They moved into the woods together, tight formation, nobody talking more than they had to. The riddle voice found them again around 10 that morning, disembodied, threading through the trees from a direction none of them could pin down. Same 3 questions, out of sequence this time, like he was testing which one of them would be the one to answer. Nobody did. Nobody trusted their own voice enough to try. They caught sight of him at a distance, moving between the trunks, unhurried the way he'd been unhurried the day before. Sims broke into a run first, fastest of the 3, and Dublin and Gavin fell in behind him, boots tearing through wet undergrowth that soaked through their laces in seconds. Sims went down hard, mid-stride, a sound coming out of him that wasn't a word. Bear trap. Steel jaw, rusted at the hinge, clamped around his ankle so fast none of them saw it happen until it already had. Dublin was closest. He broke off from the chase without a second of hesitation and closed the distance to help, because that's what you did. That's what any of them would have done. No debate, no pause to think it through first. His boot found the tripwire on the third stride. The relief of watching Dublin reach Sims lasted exactly as long as it took his foot to find that wire. Rigged, they'd realize later, at the precise height and stride length of somebody running to help, not somebody walking a trail at a normal pace. The chase was never the trap. The instinct to help was. Both men were down now. Both could still talk. Both were breathing fine. But neither one could put real weight on a leg, and the thing none of them said out loud yet was that a trap line like this doesn't get thrown together for two men chasing a stranger through the woods on a random Friday. Sims's trap had old leaves woven into the jaw hinge, dried and brittle, meaning it had been sitting there weathering through at least one full season already. This wasn't set today. This wasn't set for them. It had been waiting. Gavin crouched between the two of them, mind racing through options that all led somewhere bad. Stay and tend to Sims and Dublin, out here with no radio and no jeep. Push forward alone after a man who'd already proven he knew this ground better than any of them. Or turn back the 10 miles on foot and hope daylight held out long enough to matter. None of those were good. All of them were his to make. Sims grabbed his sleeve before he could decide, teeth gritted against the pain radiating up from his ankle, and said the thing that had been sitting unsaid in all three of their chests since the Jeep disappeared. He knew we'd split up like this. He knew exactly how we'd split up. Gavin didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that made it better. He thought about the phone call, about a number that wasn't public, reached by a man who supposedly had no idea who any of them were. He thought about the man standing at the tree line, watching them arrive like he already knew the route they'd take before they'd chosen it themselves. Every piece of this had been laid out ahead of time. The trap, the timing, even which one of them would end up alone. That last part hadn't happened yet, but it was coming, and some part of Gavin already knew it. The light was already starting to lean west through the canopy, longer shadows stretching across the trail floor than there'd been an hour ago. Somewhere behind them, the man's voice drifted through the trees one more time. Same three questions. Closer now than it had any right to be given how far they'd run. Dublin's radio, still clipped to his vest, crackled once with a voice too faint to make out clearly. Gavin looked down at Sims, at the blood already soaking through the fabric above his boot, and made the call nobody wanted him to make. The voice on Dublin's radio belonged to Petrie, signal thin enough that Gavin had to press the speaker against his ear to make it out. Gavin was the only one still mobile. That made the decision simple. Petrie needed him up on the ridge overlook, the one spot where a signal might hold long enough to call in a real rescue. Gavin hadn't chosen that. Petrie had chosen it for him, by process of elimination. He left Sims and Dublin propped against a downed oak, told them he'd be back inside the hour, and started up the ridge alone. The light went fast after that, not gradual. Fast, the kind of dusk that drops in the Smokies, like someone flipped a switch, cold enough that Gavin could track it in his own knuckles, stiff around the flashlight he hadn't needed 20 minutes ago, and needed badly now. The trail markers stopped lining up with what was in front of him. He'd check a blaze, walk 50 yards, and the next one wouldn't be where the map in his head said it should be. His radio wouldn't catch a signal, no matter which direction he turned. Then his own boot prints started showing up ahead of him on the trail, not behind him where they belonged. Ahead, pressed into soft mud he hadn't crossed yet, tread matching his own boots exactly. That answered nothing except that he'd been circling this ridge far longer than he'd tracked, and raised a worse question underneath it. How long was longer than he'd tracked, really? He didn't get to work that out. Something came down across the back of his skull, hard enough to drop him where he stood. The flashlight hit the ground first, then Gavin did, then black. Sound came back before anything else did. That was how he knew he was surfacing at all. A voice, low, close by, words he couldn't place yet. Cold ground pressed against his cheek, wet through the side of his jacket. He kept his eyes shut a beat longer than he needed to, some animal part of him understanding that being awake and looking awake were two very different things right now. In that stretched handful of seconds, he took in what he could without moving. Same clearing he'd started in, some tree shape half familiar off to the left, and the man, maybe 10 feet off, not searching, not pacing, waiting, patient. Like Gavin's waking up was happening on a schedule the man had already worked out days ago. Close enough now that the stains on the man's knees weren't a question anymore. Dried, old, layered on top of each other. More than one visit to wherever they'd come from. This had happened before, to someone else, in this exact clearing. Only once Gavin's breathing changed, shallower, faster, the shift a body makes right before it can't hide being awake anymore. Did the man finally notice? "You have one more guess. Guess my name and I'll tell you where she is." Gavin's throat felt raw, his skull pounding in time with his pulse, and the name that came out of him wasn't a real guess so much as the last thing his brain could produce under the weight of it all. Joseph. "Nope, I'm sorry, you're out of guesses." The man approached slow. No rush, no rage. He knelt beside Gavin like a man settling in for a task he'd done before, and produced a small knife, the blade dull with rust along one edge. He pressed the tip into Gavin's calf, shallow, precise, a controlled amount of pressure and no more. "That's for the first wrong guess." Gavin's whole body seized against the pain, a sound tearing out of him he didn't recognize as his own voice. The man moved the blade to Gavin's stomach. Same pressure, same care. "That's for the second wrong guess." He climbed fully over Gavin now, knees pinning him into the mud, blade drifting up toward his cheek. "That's for the—" The gunshot cracked through the clearing before the sentence finished. The man went still first, then slack, tipping sideways off Gavin into the wet ground. Gavin's own service pistol was already in his hand, still raised, smoke curling off the barrel, though he couldn't have said with any certainty when he'd drawn it, when he'd aimed it, when his finger had found the trigger. Some stretch of the last several seconds simply wasn't there for him to look back on. He lay there a long moment, chest heaving, weapons still pointed at a man who wasn't moving. There was no engine idle out here this time. No gravel under tires, no radio static. Just wind moving through branches that had nothing left on them to rustle, and underneath that, the sound of his own heartbeat finally starting to slow. Callie Sowell was never found. Search teams worked that section of the Smokies for 11 days straight. Dogs and volunteers and rangers from 3 counties over, and none of them turned up so much as a boot print that matched hers. Her file is still open. It always will be. The man who attacked Gavin in that clearing had no identification on him, no wallet, no keys, nothing sewn into the overalls that pointed to a name. His prints didn't match anything on record, not local, not state, not federal. Nobody ever figured out how he knew Gavin's radio frequency, or the unlisted number to the station line, or the exact height and stride length that would put Sims and Dublin down in the same afternoon. Nobody ever explained where he'd come from before that Thursday, or how long he'd been standing in these particular woods before Gavin's Bronco happened to round that bend. He was buried without a name on the stone. Gavin's signed permit from that morning, the one with Callie's handwriting slanted hard to the left, ink smudged where her palm had dragged across the page, never made it into the official incident report. Petrie never asked for it directly, and Gavin never volunteered it. Ruth never learned that her daughter's solo hike had been cleared by a ranger who'd looked right past the name on his way to the next form in the stack. That's the part Gavin still carries. Not the knife, not the clearing, the stamp. He stayed on with the Park Service. 6 weeks became 6 months, and 6 months became longer than that. But something in him had shifted that Friday night, and it never quite shifted back. The man who walked out of the tree line that first Thursday hadn't been afraid of anything. Not the badge, not the threats, not 3 armed rangers closing in on him in broad daylight. He'd strolled into those trees the way a man strolls into a room he already owns. Gavin isn't that man, not even close. These days, he double-checks every permit twice before he stamps it. He reads the names now, actually reads them, lets his eyes catch on the handwriting the way they should have the first time. He still flinches a little at gravel roads that curve sharper than he expects, and he still keeps that Broncos radio on, even off shift, even at home, just in case. He never got a straight answer out of that man, not once, across 3 guesses and however many years that riddle had been sitting in that stranger's mouth before Gavin ever heard it. No name, no motive, no explanation for how a man with no shoes and no record could know so much about 3 rangers he'd supposedly never met. If you've ever hiked the Appalachian Trail through the Smokies, camped near Icewater Spring, signed a permit at a ranger station, trusted that the stamp on that piece of paper meant somebody had actually looked, you've walked through the same stretch of mountain where all of this happened. The National Park Service still logs several hundred search and rescue incidents across the Appalachian backcountry every single year, and not every one of them ends the way Gavin's did. If you're planning a solo hike anywhere in these mountains, tell somebody exactly where you're going, and check in when you say you will. Because somewhere out past that ridge, there's still a stack of permits nobody's checked twice.